Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, December 6, 2024. This week's Chairman's Report is guest written by Randy Fischer, an AFFT Vice President and Board Member. The FAIRtax versus our growing U.S. national debt. After President Trump's re-election on November 5, 2024, there's been a heightened sense of urgency as it relates to our national debt. As I write this article, according to usdebtclock.org, our U.S. national debt is over $36 trillion. Now, perhaps the renewed attention is due to the belief that there may never be another opportunity like this with the incoming administration's contingent. It's as if everyone can feel that just under the surface that a massive and destructive recession is looming just outside the outskirts of our financial foresight, just inside the caverns of an almost forgotten place in our mind that keeps flashing a faint warning light. The advisory committee, known as the Department of Government Efficiency, has been launched and has been tasked with identifying and eliminating inefficiency and waste in our federal government. This has certainly heightened the attention and excitement many feel about the prospect of spending the over $4 trillion in funds the U.S. Treasury receives every year in a more efficient, less wasteful way. Some last facts and reminders before we dive in. In 2011, S&P downgraded our U.S. debt from AAA to AA+. We're nearing the point where our debt holders might just begin to want their money back. Now, this means there would be fewer entities willing to purchase more Treasury notes and T-bills to handle our insatiable spending appetite. This would lead to what's called a failed auction. Now, if this occurs, the entire house of cards falls down. And oh, by the way, in 2011, our national debt was $14.8 trillion. And again, as mentioned above, we've more than doubled that to over $36 trillion in debt now. Let that sink in. Now let's look at how enacting the FAIRtax would affect our national debt, since the topic has received the aforementioned renewed attention. Of course, the FAIRtax only affects the nation's inflows, not our out-of-control spending. However, there are several indirect effects that will lead to an eventual decrease of our growing national debt. These concepts include, among others, tax evasion, U.S. economic expansion, and transparency. First, let's look at tax evasion. The FAIRtax is estimated to reduce illegal tax evasion by 90% relative to our current income tax system. The FAIRtax would almost single-handedly erase our annual budget deficit. For 2023, the U.S. annual budget deficit was $1.7 trillion, and our annual tax gap, illegal tax evasion that should have been collected by the IRS that wasn't, is estimated at $1 trillion. Now, under any system of taxation, evasion will still exist, but the configuration of our tax collection system changes everything. The FAIRtax does not tax what is sacred to us, i.e. our income. Now, retailers are great at collecting cash and taxes, and the FAIRtax enables retailers to collect all of our nation's tax receipts, drastically decreasing the number of tax collectors, retailers rather than all businesses and individuals. Now let's look at economic expansion. Decades of thorough economic research has strongly indicated that enacting the FAIRtax would result in real wages, disposable personal income, consumption, and U.S. GDP all increasing significantly. Just imagine the effect that a 10% increase in real wages would have on our national morale, working families, our lower middle class, and the overall economy as it relates to consumption and increased disposable personal income. The FAIRtax accomplishes this in several ways, including increasing the current tax base of $5 trillion to $9 trillion with no exclusions, no exemptions, no deductions, and no loopholes. The incentive to keep trillions of dollars offshore suddenly evaporates. That money will come rushing back into the American economy as America becomes the world's tax haven. Think 0% corporate income tax rate. Now, although criminals will exist for as long as the sun rises in the east, the criminal underground and anyone in the United States illegally will finally pay their full federal tax burden as they consume at the retail register. Also, the trade deficit will shrink drastically when the prices of American goods on the world market no longer contain the 22% embedded cost of the current income payroll tax system. The resulting surge in demand for American-made products will lead to even more good-paying American jobs being created. And finally, there's transparency. With one national fair tax rate and prebate schedule, any changes to the tax system will receive unprecedented sunlight, scrutiny, and public interest. Now, currently, there's federal spending. There's also the ability to reduce net Treasury receipts through tax credits, deductions, adjustments, and exemptions. This reduction of our Treasury's coffers through reduced collections will be completely eliminated under the fair tax. Now, a great deal of the smoke and mirrors that the current income tax system uses will completely vanish. Only true federal spending will be at issue, which will, by default, be more transparent and receive heightened attention and scrutiny. Now let's think about how this would play out. After enactment, if a crafty politician wants to exclude certain expenditures from the fair tax to pander to a particular interest group, for example, excluding all purchases of prescription drugs from the fair tax, he or she will need to either reduce the prebate, good luck getting a groundswell of political support for that idea, or raise the uniform fair tax sales rate. Again, not likely a winner with the U.S. public, given that every person who consumes in the U.S. would be personally affected. This fact, along with the protection of the prebate untaxing spendings on life necessities, provides an incredible natural disinfectant to future political meddling with the fair tax. In conclusion, the fair tax will drastically reduce tax evasion and, by default, increase tax receipts. It will create a booming economy, the likes of which we've never seen before, and again, by default, increase tax receipts. And the fair tax will elegantly create the most transparent tax system ever conceived. All of this results in a perfect incubation chamber to reduce our national debt. The fair tax will increase Treasury receipts and, by default, bring forth the greatest amount of sunlight, transparency, and scrutiny to our federal spending that America has experienced in recent memory. This will undoubtedly lead to a significant curtailment of our runaway federal spending and ballooning national debt. Bring on the fair tax, Mr. President. Tear down that income tax wall. Now, the choice is easy. Do we want a system for funding the federal government that is so simple that everyone can understand it, that shows the cost of the federal government on every retail receipt so all of us understand what we're paying, that helps U.S. companies compete with foreign competitors, that keeps jobs in the United States rather than exporting them to other countries, that permanently establishes the solvency of Social Security and Medicare, and is the largest transfer of power from D.C. to the people since the Constitution was adopted? D.C. is ignoring the one real solution that allows us to remain citizens and not subjects, the fair tax. The fair tax is simple, non-invasive, but most of all, it works. The solution? Pass the fair tax. Now, why would D.C. pass the fair tax and give up an almost unlimited source of donations? Well, they won't, at least not voluntarily. The only way they will is if the rest of us demand it. Isn't it time to end this ludicrous tax collection system and the IRS along with it? Help us bring about real tax reform and stop future IRS abuses. By contributing or investing $10.40 a month, you help provide a financial base to Americans for fair taxation. Now, if you can make larger contributions/investments, these will be used not for salaries, as we're all volunteers, but for the needed updates to our economic studies, which will be vital for all future years. Please go to FAIRtax.org to invest in AFFT and help us pass the fair tax. It's an investment in your and your family's future.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.